in that beautiful, beautiful house with that great view of the Sangre de Cristos that I wrote, finished the book. And the book is titled The Woolly West, Colorado's Hidden History of Sheepscapes. And that book, as I said, was finished, in your neck of the woods. And now I really want to come back. I'm very interested in the Rio Grande National Monument and how big it is and where it goes and other BLM things near Taos. So hopefully I'll get to come and meet Phil and talk to you in person at some point. So the book, The Woolly West, sold out in hardback from Texas A&M University Press, and it'll be back out in print in softback in about 3 weeks. The Bears Ears book is the University of Utah Press, and it'll be out in the spring. And if anybody is interested in doing some kind of Bears Ears tour, I've talked to Phil about that, and we can think about that in the future. I lead tours all over the West. I've done some for New Mexico Wild, and that includes canoe trips and raft trips. And we had some canoe folks from Taos and Albuquerque and Santa Fe on the San Juan River just this last weekend. And it was great to kind of catch up on some New Mexico things. So I'm going to start off with just sort of an overview of Hispanic herders. And so La Estrella del Pastor, Hispano sheepherders from Colorado and New Mexico, culture, tradition, and sheepscapes. And when I say a sheepscape, I'm combining 2 words into 1 word. So I take the first word, sheepherder, and I combine it with landscape, and I get sheepscapes. So a sheepscape is a sheepherder landscape. And for all of you interested in archaeology, and I'm the past president of our archaeological society, the San Juan Basin Archaeological Society. A sheepscape is a historical archaeological trace or set of artifacts on a landscape. And it could be carved aspen trees, it could be a leftover corral, all sorts of things. So it's really fun to hike both in the canyons and in the high country and to find these sheepscapes. So let me begin. This is from the book And Now Miguel, an award-winning book which was set in northern New Mexico by Joseph Krumgold. He writes, in our family, there's always one thing, and that is the sheep. The summer passes and the winter comes, and soon it is Easter and the time for spring. But all the time, no matter when, there is the sheep. Everything comes and goes, except one thing, the sheep. For that is the work of our family, to raise sheep. And then I want to pair that with a quote from Aldo Leopold from a Sand County Almanac. There are 2 things that interest me, the relation of people to each other and the relation of people to the land. And so I think that's so important. Sheep were very much a dominant part of the New Mexico economy. And as New Mexicans moved into Colorado, southern Colorado, before statehood for either New Mexico or Colorado, those Hispanic herding traditions went north. And I will argue that the golden age for sheepherder carved aspen trees are those trees carved by native New Mexicans from the 1930s into about 1970. So basically 1930 to 1970 is the highlight for carved aspen trees. And although it's still going on with Basque herders and Greek herders, and even some from Peru, it's not the same. So I would urge you to help record and look for those aspen trees because they're falling. They're going to go down. Winds come and take them down. And so that really golden age is 1930 to 1970. But let me back up all the way to Oñate in 1598, coming north with 2,600 sheep. Governor Baca of Spanish New Mexico had so many sheep. Get this. Governor Baca had so many sheep. He had 2,700 herders. Think about that. 2,700 herders. 1 million sheep closely cropping that nutritious grama grass. So if you want to know why Taos looks the way it does, Taos County, Rio Arriba, Tierra Maria, everything north of I-40, it's because of all those sheep. Sheep were the foundation for the great wealth, the story of the Lunas, as in Luna County and Luna, New Mexico. And the California Gold Rush, it was New Mexico sheep that went to the California gold camps. New Mexico sheep. And in fact, the only thing Kit Carson ever did that made him a profit was he took a herd of sheep up into northern New Mexico through the Weminuche, which is now the Weminuche Wilderness, and to California. Everything else he did was kind of marginal, but he made money on those sheep. So the California Gold Rush hits, it's 1849. And Antonio Jose Luna and Antonio Jose Otero figure out, wait a minute, we have the sheep, California has the miners, let's move mutton to California. And they did. They drove 50,000 woolies to California. Sheep that were worth 50 cents in New Mexico in 1849 sold for $15 each in the California gold camps. Now you talk about a profit. Now you're going to lose some, obviously, you know, native Indians, American Indians would come and take some, but still, if you're buying those sheep at 50 cents and selling them for $15 in Sacramento, that's the foundation for family empires. So the mansion at Luna, New Mexico, which is now a restaurant, that's where it comes from. So it's been so interesting for me to work on this book, work on this research, to stay in the house in Tres Piedras that Aldo Leopold built for his new wife, Estella. And what was her full maiden name? Estella Luna Otero Bergere. So how ironic is that? One of the great ecologists, philosophers, environmentalists in American history marries into one of the biggest sheep owning families in New Mexico that had done so much damage. The whole Rio Puerco watershed, all the landscape around Cuba, you know, those grasses are not coming back. So I spent a lot of time in the Carson National Forest. I was interested in what the anthropological term is, the transhumance, or the traditions of single men from New Mexican villages, quote, following the sheep north into Colorado. And I found it very ironic that Aldo Leopold would marry into such a powerful sheep owning family, one of the most prestigious in New Mexico. And I learned all sorts of things. I learned about sheep carvings on aspen trees. I learned about lonely herders and what they thought, what they carved. And I love going into aspen groves in the fall to do that research. And I had an actual, archaeological permit in Colorado to do that work. So it's so amazing that Leopold wrote, quote, to have an ecological conscience is to live alone in a world of wounds. And yet, the Luna family had done so much eco damage. One of Leopold's daughters, Nina Leopold Bradley, wrote, quote, mother's family had a lot to do with overgrazing the West. And no question about that. So Aldo Leopold was a supervisor on the Carson National Forest north of Santa Fe. He was in a precarious position because to help the forest recover, he needed to limit grazing, and yet families expected to run both sheep and cattle in the Carson National Forest. So it's pretty interesting, that early history of Leopold. And if anybody wants to read about this, it's in my book, but I also wrote about this in a essay for Natural Resources Journal, which is published by the UNM Law School. And if anybody's interested, tell Phil and I can get him a PDF, an electronic copy of that article. When Leopold starts, his salary is $1,400 a year. His forest is 9,000 square miles. Think about that. And all the work it took to not only court his wife, but then marry her and then build this beautiful house. So that is just, it's a love story. And it's set in Taos County. It's set in Tres Piedras, right at the moment of New Mexico statehood in 1912. at Tres Piedras on the Carson, stockmen had requests for 220,000 sheep to be permitted. And Leopold tried to knock that down to 198,000, which is why he wore a pistol. And in an important meeting, he left it on his saddle and he was trying to do all these negotiations. In fact, he gets sick. He takes the train. There was a little train that went, the Chile line, that went between Colorado and New Mexico, and it came through Tres Piedras. Leopold was there, took the train into Durango to rent a horse to come back down into the northern edge of the Carson, and he gets really sick and almost dies from that, recovers in Santa Fe, and actually never goes back to the house he built, and never goes back to the Carson National Forest. He has other work in New Mexico. So get this, the Upper Rio Grande, your turf, by 1900 was the most heavily grazed watershed in the entire country, with estimates of 220,000 cattle and 1.7 million sheep, all of it the heart of public land sheep grazing. And by public land, that would mean mostly BLM, but also now forest. And families had run sheep there for 3 or 4 generations. So lots to learn about Leopold and what happened there, and the herders. So these are lonely men, they're single men, and they're gonna carve on the arbor glyphs. They're gonna carve some erotic images. They're gonna carve some pornographic images, which I photographed, but I don't, I'm not sharing. And they're gonna have to figure out how to deal with the cattle. So as cattle come up from Texas and as Texas cattlemen come into this country, lots of animosity with the Hispanic sheepherders, and that will erupt in violence, not so much in New Mexico, but just across the border into the San Luis Valley. And there's a very important story, and archaeologists have confirmed this story, of a family that had always run sheep. And they had come up after the Mexican-American War, so they'd come up after 1848. They were in Colorado when it was a territory. They're in Colorado when it becomes a state. The Texas herders come in. There's a big boom in Leadville and plenty of need for meat. And the cattlemen want to control that market, and it's a good market for mutton, so there's conflict. And this family winds up having their sheep killed, their herder harassed, and the family says, wait a minute, we're Americans now. We've taken the oath of citizenship. We want justice. So they seek to have that ranch and those cowboys in court. And they're there, they're sullen, they're, very, very rude. And while the Hispanic family is in court, somebody firebombs their house, completely destroys it. And this family had never trusted banks, and all their money was in the walls of that adobe house, and it all was burned up. And so they lost everything. Archaeologists had found the house, found, the broken glass. It had glass windows, which was part of it, stained glass windows. The son, well aware of this animosity, decided to try cattle, and in a really interesting architectural symbol, did not build an adobe house, built a log house. And it is now part of Great Sand Dunes Preserve, and it's out there somewhere. The roads, I guess, are really bad. I've never been able to get there. But what's fascinating is he's living, looking like a cattle rancher, but the inside of the house is covered with adobe, and the inside looks like a typical Southwest, Hispanic home. So, and that house, then Secretary of the Interior Salazar made sure that got listed as a National Historic Site, National Historic Landmark within this larger world. You folks have done such a good job of protecting the Rio Grande with the Rio Grande National Monument that cultural heritage protection has not crossed the state line yet, and hopefully we will do that in Colorado. So, that's the story of the Teofilo Trujillo family, and it is the cabin is now on the Medano Zapata Ranch. Another important Hispanic story took place between Pagosa Springs and Durango, where Juan Montoya, the Montoya family, is bringing sheep not over the top of Wolf Creek Pass, but basically up the San Juan River. And a Anglo county commissioner for Archuleta County had just lost a wife, lost a baby in childbirth, was very distraught. And he decides, quote, he's going to teach these Mexicans a lesson. And he rides out hard, and it's going to attack the sheep and attack the herders. And Juan Montoya, his father, had provided the herders with all new Winchester 30-30 lever action rifles. And Juan is shot at, wounded in the shoulder, drops on his horse and fires, and basically mortally wounds an Anglo county commissioner. He cannot get a fair trial in Archuleta County. The trial goes to Durango, and very contentious. And it's the only trial I was ever able to find in Colorado history where the Hispanic family and the herder basically prevails. And the jury is out for a very short period of time, about an hour, and comes back and says self-defense, which it was. So those are some of the stories in the book, the stories of the cattle and sheep wars. So I want to move forward now from the, I talked about the California gold rush, New Mexican sheep going to California, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. Well, we come all the way up to the 1930s, and there is now a standard practice of New Mexican herders, young men and older men, uncles and sons and brothers, moving north into Colorado to help with the lambing season, and then to take the sheep into the high country in the summer and reverse that and bring them back out in the fall. And then they get a little time at Christmas at home. And this was so important to the northern New Mexican economy. And in a typical racist situation, in April of 1936, the Colorado governor decides to close the border. He's worried about immigrants, and he declares martial law to prevent New Mexican herders from coming into Colorado. And the sheepmen are saying, wait a minute, what are you doing? The New Mexico governor says you can't do that. And anyway, it becomes quite a scene, and finally is reversed simply because these are very, very valuable employees. So what had happened in northern New Mexico, what had happened in Colorado, is the ricos, the rich families, controlled the landscape. Their sheep ate all the grass, so it was almost impossible for a young person, a young rancher, to get started. They had to become itinerant herders. Few jobs existed in Abiquiu, Coyote, Tres Piedras, Las Truchas, Espanola, Lumberton, or Chama. They had to go north. And they did so in the Great Depression, and the money they brought back was essential to keeping those little villages going. And it's interesting, guess where the money went first? So you've been out there as a herder, you're coming home to your mother or your wife. Guess where she wants to spend that money first? That money went for cook stoves, big cook stoves. And every little mercantile from Los Ojos down, that's what they sold when the herders came, was families wanted a new cook stove, and they got it. So, that the whole boycott at the border is really a tragic thing. It was just ridiculous. And finally, then this migratory labor is honored. It continues pretty much up to about 1907, and I'm sorry, 1970. And what they wanted to buy with their funds were a kitchen range for the women in their lives. So native New Mexicans retained their village ties. They may have spent years herding sheep in Colorado's high country, but home remained the New Mexican highlands, with one important exception, southern Colorado. So some of the herders did eventually migrate, move into the San Luis Valley. And this is so different from the Basques and the Greeks. So going further north into Colorado, you had some Basque families and Basque herders in New Mexico. But here in Colorado, they were basically south of the I-70 line. And then Greeks were north. So Greeks were in northwest Colorado. There were some Basques in southwest Colorado, Hispanic herders sort of everywhere. But their relationship to the land was different, because the Basques and Greeks decided to stay and buy land. So the New Mexican herding tradition was to come into Colorado and go home. Well, World War I happens and you're not going home if you're Basque or Greek. And so they started to buy high altitude land, especially after 1934 with the Taylor Grazing Act. So the Taylor Grazing Act is an attempt to finally legislate controls over what we would now call BLM. The Forest Service had enforced grazing regulations as early as 1905. But when you take the sheep out of the high country in the summer, where do you put them in the winter? You put them on lower elevation lands. There were no rules for those lands. So cattlemen and sheepmen fought over those BLM lands. The Taylor Grazing Act was to stop that and turn that into allotments. But here's the interesting caveat. If you're going to graze on lower elevation BLM lands after 1934, you must have what is legally called commensurability, which means you have to have commensurate private land to go with your public land. So they start buying land because they have to put their sheep on it when they take it off public land. And those families, guess what most of those families bought in the 1930s in Colorado? High altitude grass. They didn't want gold mines or silver mines. They just wanted grass. They bought up old homesteads. Homesteaders had gone broke. Every one of those families wound up buying the base for ski areas. So the base of Taos, Snowmass, any ski area you can think of, those were sheep pastures. And if those families kept that land all the way through the ski boom in the 1970s and 80s, they've done really well. And one of the Greek families I interviewed the widow of one of the sheepmen, and she told me that her husband had been there when Vail Associates, the entrepreneurs who were going to start Vail, came over the top of this meadow, and here these very wealthy guys are getting sheep shit on their shoes, and they say to the sheepman, "Well, we're going to put a ski area here," and he says, "Oh, really? Well, good luck with that." Well, they did, only they put the base of the first ski lift on his property. The surveyor got it wrong, so they sent him a check, and he tore it up into little pieces and he sent it back. And they sent him a bigger check, and he tore it up into little pieces and sent it back. And finally, they came to him with a bottle of ouzo and a checkbook and negotiated the first sale of private property in the Vail Valley. So it's fascinating doing this research, not only looking at the Hispanic connections back into northern New Mexico, the Mormon connections from Utah into Colorado and from Wyoming down into Colorado, and then the Greeks and the Basque and those families, and why they decided to stay here, how they did what they did. It was really exciting, to learn about that. Let me give you an example. Pagosa Springs had 150,000 sheep permitted at one point. Right now, the Pagosa Springs Ranger District doesn't have a single sheepherder. There's no sheep. It's gone. As far as I know, there's no sheep now north of I-40. Los Ojos was where Tierra Wolves were. Tierra Wolves isn't at Los Ojos anymore. It's closer to Chama. I don't think there are any flocks out there. This is really a dying tradition, so important to New Mexican history. It's just sad. You know, the herders had to go north. Quote, by the 1930s, forage in the mountains was so scarce that cattle were beginning to starve to death. The per capita income in Vallecitos, New Mexico, was per capita was under $200. So, you know, it was over. And the Depression then changes things forever. So a few more things just about herder culture, and then I'll show you some slides. One is sheep camp cuisine. If you've never sat down and practiced your Spanish with a sheep herder and had some great food, let me tell you, they keep the beans on all day. The coffee is strong enough to float a horseshoe. Usually there's biscuits. And sometimes there used to be what were called tin dogs. And this is a folk term. So the coffee would be spiced with canned milk. Each of the little milk cans would be put on a big wire loop, and the herder would shake that to help get the sheep moving. And in just a few museums, I've seen that. So if anybody finds any tin dogs, they're pretty rare. The food was magnificent, you know, a little mutton. And of course, occasionally a lamb would break its leg. Maybe the herder just decided he was tired of mutton. But oh, if you've never had lamb stew, and then of course everything is added with roasted chilies and chili powder. So here's a description of a Colorado family with Hispanic herders, and this is a food description. Quote, with a kettle of beans simmering on the camp stove, the coffee kept warm by the stovepipe, bread baking in a pit of ashes, the men out all day with the sheep. In the evening, they were assured of a meal such as the most efficient wife could not match, recalled one sheepman's spouse. Later, when this sheepman had leased his sheep and didn't have any more, rented his range, the stockman complained to his wife of not being well fed. He teased his wife. He said, I'm going to sheep camp and get a good meal. To which she responded, I'm going with you. So that's pretty funny. The whole idea of luminarias, the herders did that. And they, of course, are up before dawn. So the morning star is the herder's star. They want to get those sheep moving, and then, you know, the sheep will rest during the day. So there's, in my book, I've got Hispanic terms. And then one more, I think, really important story is about penitentes. Now, you have this strong penitente tradition in northern New Mexico, and there were families, Hispanic families from northern New Mexico coming into southern Colorado. And I write a column for the Durango. Whoops, I got a sheepdog here making noise. Stop. I write a column for the Durango Herald, and I wrote about sheepherder carvings. And a penitente family contacted me and said, can we go to lunch? We want to talk to you. And I said, yes. And it turns out their family had placed a cross, a crucifix, a big one, on public land, on a national forest. And the cross was weathering and deteriorating. It was there in the 1930s. And they wanted to know what to do with it. And I said, well, you know, we can find a museum, we can do something, but let me think about it. And that day, I was out of town, and I got to thinking. That semester, I had some students from Zuni. And if you don't know, Fort Lewis College, where I teach, has free tuition for Native American students. So we have students from over 500 tribes. We get 100 kids from Alaska. So my classes are really interesting because we have all these Native students. And I got to thinking about the Zuni tradition of taking war gods and leaving them in shelters and shrines, where the importance of the war god was to deteriorate, that's part of the blessing. And so I said to this penitente family, I said, you know, I've rethought that. Here's the Zuni tradition. Why don't you leave that cross exactly where it is and maybe consider building a new one? Well, I didn't think they would. They did. And one of the great opportunities of my life was to be invited then with this large extended Hispanic family. People came from 8 states to carry this cross on our backs with our hands and shoulders up to the top of a mountain and put it there behind the historic cross. And did we tell the forest archaeologist we were doing this? No. Is it illegal to put religious symbols on public land? Yes. We did it anyway because the family wanted to. And it's been very exciting, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. So just to round things up, nobody eats lamb anymore. The average American eats, oh, good. Hey, glad to see those hands. The average American eats less than a pound of lamb a year. Nobody wears wool. We all wear synthetics. More wool wearers, I see them. So the whole industry is in flux and changing, but it was fascinating for me to contact some of these great families and to ask them questions. And of course, one of the questions you can never ask a rancher is, how big is your ranch? That's very, very rude. And I was trying to figure out these Greek families that really have dynasties where they've got oil and gas wells, and they have elk hunts, and they have sheep, and they have alfalfa. And I finally figured it out, and I said, okay, well, how many sheepdogs do you have? Or better yet, how much do you spend on dog food? Because if I knew how many dogs they had, I could figure out how many herders, about 900 sheep to a herder. And he laughed at me and he said, our dog food bill is $30,000 a year. So that gives you some idea of how many sheep they raise. All those lambs go to Whole Foods. And so these are very conservative farmers, ranchers, but their market is, get this, guess who is propping up the mutton market today in America? You'll never believe this. I had to track this one down. Muslim immigrants in Phoenix, Denver, Philadelphia, Boston. Muslim immigrants, just like Jewish kosher, have to butcher a goat or a lamb in a certain way. So they want a fresh carcass, and they're not going to buy, New Zealand or Australian lamb. So how amazing. And I've given this speech. I'd love to talk to you in person, but I've given this speech enough. Everybody wants to talk to me. Not everybody wants to talk to me in public. So they wait until the speech is really over, and then they chat. And I had one guy from Cortez, Colorado, come up to me and say, I didn't want to say this, but I'm a trucker, and I every month move 400 mutton, old ewes, to Phoenix for meat for Muslim immigrants. All right, let us go to the photos. So let me see. I'm gonna, how do you want me to do this, Phil? Just
well, you can, if you have it up on your screen, what you want to share, you can do it like we
okay, can you see that?
Earlier. No, you gotta push, there you go. Go ahead and share what you want to.
Oh, okay. Now, can you see it?
Nope. Yeah, go ahead and open, like we did before there, onto your desktop.
Okay, share screen. All right.
Wherever your slides are, go ahead and open that onto your laptop.
All right. You see those?
Not seeing them. Let's see. Yeah. Wherever your slides are, you need to be able to see it on your laptop. Can you see that?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm
then-
seeing it, but if you're
Okay,
not,
then go to the bottom and click on share screen on the green one. Put your arrow down there.
how's that?
Okay, there you go.
Okay. All right. So carved aspen trees. This is on a sheep herder stock driveway coming up out of New Mexico. Okay, I'm trying to,
There you go. That's better.
right. I'm just trying to figure out my cursor went away.
If you click on there, yeah, okay.
Okay, so you can see that, is that correct?
That's perfect. Then just use
Okay, all right, here we go. So here is one of the erotic images, and archaeologists have called these, quote, Venus of the forest. This is fabulous. This is a almost like a Greek nymph of some sort, some kind of satyr. Look at that. The guy's got a stomach ache. So the question is, he's got a stomach ache. The question is it the herder with the stomach ache, or does he want his boss to have a stomach ache? This is really fabulous. This was a herder from New Mexico. And notice the woman with her hat, and then look at the witch. Look at the witch at her throat. So that could be La Llorona at her throat. This is a photograph a friend of mine loaned me, a very Hollywood-esque movie poster signed by Mr. Vigil in 1957. We went looking for this. The tree is long gone. So this gives you a good idea. These are probably Basques, but there's a great sheep wagon. And then, you know, many of the herders will be penitentes and join a variety of fraternal organizations. You know, fall is coming. Get out there among the aspen trees. Look at that date, 1932. Phil, can you still hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Española, Spain. This is a boot. And the Basques, even though we'd had World War II, we were limiting immigrants. Basques were allowed because of the power of Senator McCarran from Nevada, who continued to let Basques come in on visas when other people from war-torn Europe could not come. These are really rare. That's a ancient cross design. This is on a set of trees, pretty much right on the New Mexico-Colorado border. And look at that guy's mustache. That is just gorgeous. And his eyelashes. So this is from a place where New Mexican herders would come up, and then the sheep would have to be counted. So it's a big set of corrals and really good arbor glyphs right there. Here we go again. From Chama, and the date, July 24th, 1934, and he's showing off his handwriting, probably learned in a one-room school. So, you know, when the aspen leaves are turning, what a great time to go look for carvings. And then in the high country, there are cairns, sheepherder cairns on trails. So it's just so much fun doing this field work. This was really rare. It's a little faint, but that's because it was carved so precisely. This is a Navajo herder carving a yay dancer. Kilroy was here. The herders, some of them went off into World War II. They came back and they made symbols like this. This was amazing to find. This is a portrait of someone's mother, carved by Jose Emilio Salazar in honor of his mother, possibly on her birthday. This is the gorgeous country up north of Interstate 70, the Flat Tops Mountains. There was a lot of sheep up there. And we find this guy who was from Taos and always carved little cabins with smokestacks. There you go. Look at that. Picasso could not have done a better job of delineating a female figure. That is just an amazing little carving. These are some of the Greeks I was talking about. Gus Halandras. This is July 12th, 1975. Gus then has sort of retired from the sheep business, but he has started one of the great sheepdog trials. So if you want to see sheepdogs, Meeker, Colorado, pretty much the end of this month, I think, they have the sheepdog trials, and that is a lot of fun to watch. This is V Rock, almost on the border between New Mexico and Colorado, and there are many stories about taking sheep way up into what's now the South San Juan Wilderness on the top of V Rock. This is between Delta and Grand Junction, and this was a country where there were a lot of sheep and herders in the winters. This is the original cross I was telling you about, and the Hispanic family that told me about it. And look at that. This is amazing. This I'd never seen before. These are portraits done in a sheep shed in the middle of South Park, sort of, 100 miles from Denver, and Hispanic herders who had been there. And I think this is more lampooning, but really interesting to find the sheepherder art. And the paint they're using is what they use to dye the sheep, to identify who had which sheep in which flock. And look, here's a full-on horse. And then the signature, Alfredo Romero from Arroyo Hondo, New Mexico, May 22nd, 1931. And then he's back 1930, 1930, 1935, all in this sheep shed. This is really rare. This is a penitente cross on a tree in the same area near Fairplay, Colorado. So this was a folklore way of identifying that you were a penitente and that other herders would know you were there. This is the modern cross that I helped carry up to this peak. And the family goes back every year. And as soon as we can deal with COVID, I hope to get invited back. And this is a cairn near Lone Cone, the same pretty much archaeological site, historical archaeological site. And my hunch is this is Basque. So Basque herders had a very different cairn tradition, which you see a lot of in Montana and Idaho. And I think this is Basque, not Hispanic. This is the painting on the cover of my book, clearly showing, the Texas cattleman confronting a Hispanic herder. It's very accurate, including the rifle. So Texas cowboys usually had pistols, but not rifles. And the herders, particularly the Greeks and the Basques, are going to have rifles, and they're going to use them. So this is what you'd look for if it's still out there in the forest, are these signs that say center stock driveway. The center stock driveway allowed sheep to move from low altitude to high altitude, and the cattlemen left them alone as long as they stayed in the driveway. And that is the end of the photos, and I'm happy to have Phil help with any questions.
Thanks, Andrew. That was great. Yeah, like you said, they need to record all those aspen trees because they don't live forever. Yeah, a lot of those are probably logging, or they're collecting firewood in those camps at the same time, I suppose. Yeah. So if anyone has any questions, there's not that many of us, there's 20 or so. You can unmute yourself and ask a question from the group. I don't really see any in the chat per se. Rebecca Quintana mentioned there may be 850 ewes or so up by Chama, somewhere in a flock.
Okay,
She's probably driven by a few times,
okay.
I suppose. Anyone else have any questions for Andrew?
I was curious about at what height were these tree carvings found on the tree? Were they several feet up off the ground? Were they, what growth pattern?
That's a really good question. The best carvings can be anywhere from, sort of chest high to being done on horseback. The best carvings were done with a very tip point of a knife, maybe even a horseshoe nail. And as the tree grew and expanded, that line became more apparent. Nowadays, people just butcher an aspen tree, whereas these really good carvers, it might take years for their design to become apparent as the tree grew and as the aspen skin stretched. So they're at all different heights, not much higher than what you might find on horseback. Most of them are chest to shoulder high.
I had a question. How would you know when you encountered a carving that it was a sheepherder carving?
Because they're because of these stock driveways.
Ah,
So the stock driveways are places where for, decades, if you were moving sheep from, say, 5,000 feet to 10,000 feet, there were specific places where the Forest Service wanted you to go. And so it's those groves that had year after year after year sheep herders, and they actually talked to each other on the trees. They spoke to each other through the trees. And some herders would even carve a new date, and they might be there July 15th, 1934, and then they're there July 18th, 1936. And so you have this whole history on aspen trees. So here's a question from James, and I saw it a second ago. Please pop it back up. It was a question about sagebrush.
Yeah, the dominance of the sagebrush is due to overgrazing the native prairie grass.
Correct. And absolutely. And not only is it the sheep that overgrazed, but on the old Spanish Trail, as traders brought back horses and mules from California and left, hundreds of them near Taos, thousands near Taos, that didn't help. So it's both because of overgrazing from sheep, and then the sort of equine traffic coming east on the old California Trail.
So there's a question about Basque surnames in this area. And what would be some examples of the Basque surnames in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado?
Boy, let me think. I'm more familiar with the surnames in Nevada. That they're going to end with X, or they're going to have interesting Q's in them. There's not a particular name that comes to me, so I'm going to have to pass on that. It's in the book. The Greek names I'm more familiar with: Theos. Yeah, like that. So I'll have to pass on the Basque name. Sorry.
Okay. There's a question about, were there any rock art examples from the sheepherders that were really identifiable through that time period?
Extremely rare. There's some rock art up by Rangeley, Colorado, from a herder, but as far as I know, he's the only Hispanic herder that ever did rocks.
Okay. So
I,
anyone
share?
else?
Bill,
Hello,
can I share a question?
yes, you may.
Thank you for your chat. I think we met, your talk. I think we met a few years ago. I was out at Leopold's cabin when you were there, and we had a nice visit.
Good.
And I may have shared with you then that I recorded carved aspen trees on my Estes Ridge in Taos, which is across from Fort Bergwin on 518 for, I don't know, 4 or 5 months one summer. And the most interesting carving that we found was longhand script in Spanish going around the trunk of the tree, delineating the land grant, the corner of the land grant, and dates that they had written that sentence around the tree. And it was just really wonderful to try to read it, which I can't remember now what it said. And you're right, there was some wonderful carved artwork that was just beautiful, rearing horses and cabins with the smoke coming out of the chimneys, and one gal's name was all over the forest up there. That was fun. And to answer a previous question, in Arroyo Seco here, there was a sheepherder, Felipe Cordova, who's passed away now, but he came over, he was a Basque, and he first lived in San Cristobal, I think. And his family did a lot of sheep herding. He started that when he was a child around here. So that's one name, Cordova.
Okay.
I enjoyed your lecture. Thank you.
Okay, Christine, thank you.
Yeah, it might be interesting, to trace the DNA of these sheep and see how far back they go, if any of them go back to Oñate or, some of those earlier breeds of sheep. Eventually, they could probably find out.
Well, there are churro sheep that the Navajos have, and some of them could be out of those historic flocks. So that's where I'd start, would be in some remote places on the Navajo Nation.
Yeah, so any idea how many of these sheep would have bells on them? We've surveyed out on the mesa and found some sheep bells from the 20s, I think, maybe the teens out there.
There'd probably be a bell on every 100 sheep. So that would be an older sheep that hopefully would act like a guide and keep the younger ewes and lambs in order. And so if there was a real trustworthy sheep, they'd get the bell. Or conversely, if there was a troublesome sheep and kept running away, the herder might put a bell on it to know where it went.
And so they were just all following the bells around the herd.
Yeah.
That would help
Yeah.
guide. Okay, I hadn't really thought about that. That's interesting.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and hope to see you in person sometime, and definitely stay in touch with Phil. And that book, The Willie West, will be back out here in print in another couple weeks. And have a great fall in Taos. So thank you very much.
As soon as we can, we'll organize a trip to Bears Ears. So I'll be talking about that with the group and seeing when we're ready to go do that. That'll be great. So by the way, our next talk is October 11th. It's Chris Castledine from Tonto National Forest in Arizona. And he'll be talking to us about archaeological sites down there. The TAS website's down for a minute, a day or two, because we are transferring domain names that I'm trying to discover the password through various means that CJ had. So I'm working on that. So don't worry, you'll be seeing the information and the October TAS bulletin very soon in your email. So thanks everybody for coming. Thanks Andrew for the talk. Excellent, really interesting stuff. And I think everybody can relate to what you're saying about the sage and why we don't
Right.
grass.
Okay, thank you.
Take care, everybody. We'll see ya.